I'm Charlotte Pence, the director of the Stokes Center for Creative Writing, and I'm very excited to bring to you today a craft talk on the use of persona by one of the best in the poetry world, Brad Tice. Bradford Tice is the author of 2 books of poetry, Rare Earth, which is named the winner of the 2011 Many Voices Project, and What the Night Numbered, winner of the 2014 Trio Award. His poetry and fiction have appeared in such periodicals as the Atlantic Monthly, North American Review, The American Scholar, Epoch, as well as Best American Short Stories. He currently teaches at Nebraska Wesleyan University and lives in Omaha. Welcome, Brad.
Thanks so much for having me, Charlotte.
So before you get started with your craft talk, I was just curious if you wouldn't mind sharing with listeners how you came to be interested in the use of a persona.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you again, Charlotte, for having me, and thanks to the Stokes Center for Creative Writing for, hosting these events. I think these are amazing. It's so much fun when I get to talk about what I have pursued in my life as a passion. So that's a really great question. Why do I write in persona? And this was a question that I kind of thought a lot about in preparing for this talk. And I think in some ways, I came to persona because of a very strong sense of maybe not feeling good enough to be a writer. And what I mean by that is that I got into creative writing when I was a sophomore in college as an undergrad. I am a first generation college student. My family was very, very working class. I went to college on Uncle Sam's dime, right? So, and I was also a queer student, right? Like I had recently come out in my hometown to all of my friends and family, and then, off I went to the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, right? So that all created in me this sense that, when I was sitting in those sort of classrooms in college, I had a sort of profound sense that I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be there, right? Like, who was I, right? To be sitting in these spaces. And also, like, as a queer, individual, I think if you go up, especially in the American South, as a queer individual, you have this strong sense of, kind of imbibing some of those narratives about being abnormal, about being kind of less than. So I was kind of struggling with that at the same time that I was trying to come out and sort of, really sort of fully realize myself as a queer individual. So all that sort of added up to me having a very, very strong sense of imposter syndrome, right? So when I was in this sort of creative writing class and being asked to write about myself, I had this sense of, well, who am I to be kind of mucking about in the rarefied air that was poetry, right? And you can already sort of see in that sort of comment, certain assumptions that I had about poetry, right? Which were very much not true, right? But yeah, there was a strong sense of what do I have to say about anything? So in a way to combat that, I kind of use persona to create some distance between myself and this sort of writing self that I was sort of engaged with, right? So whenever I went to the page, I had a strong sense that it wasn't exactly me that was writing. It was sort of this sort of guise that I put on. And part of that was to, address my own trepidations. Part of it was a kind of result of genre, as I talked about, right? Poetry in my mind had this sort of air to it. And when I went to write poetry, I kind of put on a poetry mask, right? So much so that one of my early professors, Professor Marilyn Callett, who was fantastic, kind of had to pull me aside at one point and say, you're being a little bit too kind of lofty, in some of your writing, pull down the purple prose a little bit. And also there was that sense of, since I was sort of a queer individual who had spent a lot of his youth sort of kind of feeling that there was something sort of different about me, but not quite being able to kind of name that when I looked back on those experiences, I was aware that the kind of me that was writing that self was not the self that I was then. So that sort of distance of time and experience, kind of changed, like, the viewing. I was kind of re-seeing experience in the way that we talk about when we talk about memory and memoir and that sort of thing. So I was always writing with a persona. I feel like that, and in some ways, I think that was good for me because, as I said, it gave me that distance. But also, I think in being aware of the personas that I donned as a writer, it kind of gave me the ability to kind of play within those personas. I could both be myself and a little bit not myself. And in that sort of, kind of middle ground, I was able to sort of figure out who I was as a writer and what I wanted to do. So I think that persona was really, really helpful to me. And I think that's writing in persona and thinking about voice is a really good thing for a lot of poets to think about, right? Mm-hmm. So I wanted to kind of talk about that in this YouTube video, right? Okay. Why write in persona? Like, what's the value of that? Why sort of cultivate these alternative voices, right?
All right, I'll recede then into the background and I'll let you take it away from here.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Okay.
So I often feel like that, when we talk about persona, especially when we talk about it in regards to poetry, persona is often thought of as the kind of side quest that you could do as a poet, right? When we take those creative writing classes, in the unit on poetry, we spend a lot of time talking about the importance of word choice and form and the line and sound. And oftentimes kind of tucked at the end is this sort of, conversation about, voice, persona, in, I think the kind of message is that once you kind of mastered all these other things, you might try as a lark, this idea of writing from the point of view from a voice that is not your own. And that's like profoundly different in some ways than what we're asked to do as fiction writers, I think. And fiction writing is so sort of centered on the idea of capturing a character, of the author sort of taking up the mask of this sort of alternative self and telling a story, right? Or telling the story through a narrator who's also kind of like, a masked self, right? But poetry is such a genre that is wedded to the self, especially nowadays with the advent of the lyric, that sort of form of the poem, which is all about, the first person I kind of capturing experience, capturing memory, capturing thought. So I think that idea of how much poetry is sort of yoked to the self kind of lends itself for us to think that persona is something that is not necessarily something that we do with poetry, right? That when we go into poetry, we're digging into the raw material of the self, right? But this was not always true. In the early history of poetry, of course, poetry operated as an oral chronicle. It was important to preserving cultural and historical events. It was a way of knowing and remembering. The poet was often thought of as the witness or the scribe. It was like there was a kind of communal obligation there. And as a result, the first person was rarely used in verse at that time. But however, that has kind of changed profoundly in the years that have followed. But I think it's imperative to constantly remind ourselves as poets that the voices that we speak in when we create art, that these are constructions, right? And that when we go to write, we're creating a mask that we wear, even when we are writing about ourselves. Sometimes the mask that we wear is a mask of ourselves, kind of looking back on an experience. So I think that there's some advantages to thinking of writing in this way. And I wanted to talk about those. And, in talking about those, I wanted to mention kind of 3 essays that I've sometimes used in my classrooms to kind of contextualize this sort of topic of writing in persona, writing in a particular voice, right? So the first essay that I'll mention is an essay by a fiction writer named Stephen Schwartz called Finding a Voice in America. I really love this essay. And it's all about that topic of voice, that sort of ephemeral thing that's thought to be the kind of signature of the writer, right? Voice is like that thing that's meant to be the kind of calling card of the writer, so that if we read a story by Ernest Hemingway or William Faulkner, just simply through their voice, we can sort of identify them. But Schwartz, in this essay, Finding a Voice in America, he talks about that oftentimes when we talk about voice, it's sort of, an ephemeral term. Like, what do we mean when we talk about voice? And he writes that, oftentimes when we write about voice, we talk about style, we talk about diction, we talk about the arrangements of words on the page, and that creates that sort of unique signature, that unique speaking voice. But in this essay, Schwartz kind of puts forward a really, I would say, kind of radical idea that in addition to voice being style, diction, syntax, right? That also a really sort of key component to voice is this concept of identity, right? Or what I like to call positionedness, right? That when we go to write, we come to the writing experience from a particular background, from a particular way of life, particular education. And this creates a unique way that we see the world, right? So part of voice is that, what we bring to the table that makes a sort of unique viewing experience, right? So where we stand and what we bring to the viewing shapes and colors the way that we see and experience. So if we think about a writer like Flannery O'Connor, perhaps one of the most unique and singular voices in American literature, it would almost be impossible to think about her voice and her writing as being separate from her identity, first as a female writer who was very kind of defiantly kind of writing against what would be typically at that time thought of as, women's literature, right? It would be impossible to separate her from her background as a Southern writer, from her identity as a Catholic. All of these things sort of shape that really unique way that she has of viewing the world, right? And this was something that I found that I could really identify with. As I said, as a queer writer, I feel like that I've always been aware that now my identity as a queer person is not the end all and be all of who I am. I don't want to sort of be kind of pigeonholed to only being a queer writer, but it's definitely something that has sort of shaped the way that I view the world, right? In fact, I was recently included in an anthology of poetry called Queer Nature. And the entire anthology is built around this idea that queer individuals see the natural world differently, that sort of alternative identity creates an alternative way of seeing that topic, that's of seeing the natural world and seeing it differently and through a kind of queered lens, a kind of queered eye. So I think this is really sort of important, this idea of voice being yoked to identity, and that we as writers need to think about how our unique experiences, our positionness, create a kind of singular voice, a singular way of looking at the world, right? Another essay that I often teach that I think is kind of related to this topic is an essay by Viktor Shklovsky, who is a Russian literary theorist, critic, and writer, called Art as Technique. And in this essay, Art as Technique, Shklovsky introduces the concept of defamiliarization. And in this essay, Shklovsky argues that defamiliarization is the artistic technique of presenting to audiences common things in an unfamiliar or strange way so that you can gain new perspective on them, right? So the metaphor that he uses is, at one point in the essay, he talks about that we've already probably all had the experience of kind of maybe driving to work one day, and we get to our destination and we get out of the car. We have that sort of strange, surreal experience of thinking about, yeah, wow, I have no memory of having driven here. Like, I went through all the turns, I wove in and out of traffic. I got here, I parked. I have no memory of it, right? Like it was all kind of done automatically. And Schlosky argues that this is kind of typical of human beings, right? Like, in our day-to-day lives, we're so inundated by stimuli that if we were to be hyper-focused on all the details surrounding us, we would never be able to get through our day. We would be kind of overstimulated. So Schlosky argues that in our day-to-day world, we tend to tune out a lot of stuff. But Schlosky argues that art does exactly the opposite of this, right? Like rather than get us to tune out, art wants us to refocus, to re-see the world. So that's that concept of defamiliarization, that the process of art is to kind of enact that, right? But it follows that if we sort of assume that the purpose of art is to make the world unfamiliar and strange, it follows that another function of our art forms is to make ourselves unfamiliar and strange, right? So that we are part of that defamiliarization process. And I think that's really kind of a wonderful opportunity that persona allows us to make ourselves unfamiliar and strange. And putting on another guise, it's still us, but we maybe kind of speak differently, we see differently. And in that sort of made strangeness, magic can happen, new things can maybe kind of be generated. The last sort of essay and poet that I'll mention is, of course, John Keats, who in his famous letters introduced the theory of negative capability. And I always love kind of talking about this concept, because I think this is something that students initially kind of resist, but then really kind of dig into. According to Keats, negative capability is sort of like a concept where the poet must bury self-consciousness so that she might enter into a space of openness to experience. Now, I love the beginning of that quote, right? That we have to bury self-consciousness, right? That part of opening ourselves up to the world, to new experiences, new ways of seeing and thinking, is that we have to bury the I. We have to kind of bury ourselves to a certain extent. So according to Keats, a great thinker is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching for fact and reason. In other words, the secret to poetry, if you will, right, is this ability to identify with the object and subject contemplated. But in order to do that, we have to kind of push down the self a little bit. And that will allow us to kind of be able to enter into this new sort of state of being. And this is what I sometimes like to call the resurrection process, right? We bury the self in order to discover what will emerge later from the grave, what new gospels, what new news of the universe might be allowed to speak, emerge from this idea of kind of repressing the self to a certain extent. So I think this is kind of central to my ideas about why the persona, writing a persona, has so much potential, that in making ourselves unfamiliar, paradoxically, we get closer to the self, right? There's the potential to discover more about who we are, right? And this is something that as a queer poet, I think that I was always maybe kind of aware of and kind of attuned to. I am a huge fan of RuPaul's Drag Race. I'm a huge, I'm vastly fascinated by, queer culture's sort of performative niches, drag culture, BDSM culture, where you have the enactment of the Leatherman, who is kind of this hyper embodiment of masculinity. I love these, right? RuPaul is very famous for having said, "We are born naked and the rest is drag," right? Which kind of lends itself to this idea that all of existence is this idea of a kind of, maskedness, right? Like a kind of masquerade that we do. And if we think about like where the term persona comes from, like I think it sort of aligns with this idea that, persona is derived from Latin and is used to describe the masks that were used in ancient Greece by actors on the stage to exaggerate their features, right? Persona is also a term that was taken up by psychoanalysts such as Carl Jung, who adapted the definition to refer to the public mask that one presents to others. According to the psychoanalysts, when we think about the creation of the self, that the self is often created through the intersection of two things. On the one vector, you have that sort of sense of an inner life, right? Who I am at my core, that sort of sense of like, the me, right? That is sort of like the root of all my being, right? But according to psychoanalysts, that's the self is created on that vector, sort of running into or intersecting our sort of public selves, that we often also define ourselves through the way that we perceive the outside world thinking of us, right? So that we kind of shape ourselves in some ways according to these sort of outside influences of culture, society, education, politics, et cetera, et cetera. And I always kind of loved that, like, that the self is this sort of negotiation between a very sort of private life and a public life, right? Like, we often say that the personal is political, but that's just another way of saying that the personal is public, right? That, the self is created in those two vectors. All right. So when I was sort of like, getting started in my writing career, I first got into writing persona with my first book, Rare Earth. I did a series of poems that I kind of call the devil poems. And in each of these pieces, I took on the sort of guise of a devil coming out of Christian cosmology, as well as other sort of mythology. So like kind of Lucifer, Lilith, Beelzebub, et cetera, et cetera. And what was sort of fascinating in the creation of these poems is that when I put on the mask of these devils, and just FYI, I sort of got into this project because at the time that I was writing, in popular culture, there was a lot of conservative sort of religious figures who would oftentimes point to homosexuals, like queer individuals, and others, like, who they perhaps didn't care for, right, as being kind of the culprit behind certain kind of natural events that were occurring, like, hurricanes, earthquakes, like, you had sort of like, kind of conservative religious pundits who would say, oh, all of this is a result of America sort of sanctioning, queer individuals, right? So that was sort of in the background of these poems. So when I put on the mask of these devils, I found myself sort of responding to that in some ways, this idea of a kind of queer self, responding through the mask of this sense of a world seeing me as a kind of bedeviled figure, right? And, in thinking about how this relates to drag culture, in watching shows such as RuPaul's Drag Race, one of the things that I find fascinating is that oftentimes when they sort of interview the contestants on that show, they talk a lot about how, the moment where they put on drag for the first time was a moment where they often, had these sort of moments of self-discovery, that they felt that they were able to be more themselves when they were done up in drag than when they were outside of drag, which is sort of a kind of paradox in itself, right? How can you feel more like yourself when you're pretending to be someone that you're essentially not? But I think that we've all had that experience before of, Halloween is my favorite holiday. So like, when you put on those masks, when you put on the costume, something happens where it's you that you're still there, but in some ways you're allowed to speak the unspeakable without direct ownership, consequence, or reproach. It asks us to Also consider why certain things are unspeakable. Why do we need to wear masks to say certain things? And I think that can become part of the process of what's discovered when we write in persona. Not only like, what is unspeakable, but why certain things are unspeakable. All right. So as I said, like, the persona, I think, is a great tool to amplify the features of both a creative character, but also to reveal a good deal about ourselves as poets, as writers. It's a medium that is both confessional and fictive, both personal and impersonation, right? Think about that sort of classic image of Clark Kent going into the phone booth, right? When there's a crisis, ripping his shirt open, taking off his glasses, and suddenly he's Superman, this alter ego. And we're never quite sure which is more fundamentally, his Clark Kent self. Is it like, the sort of mild-mannered intellectual individual, or is it Superman, the sort of, the strong, powerful figure underneath? Well, in fact, it's both, right? But sometimes we have to kind of don the alter ego to sort of get to those shadow selves. It's this term that Carl Jung often used, those shadow selves that are perhaps kind of underneath in the subconscious that are kind of waiting to emerge. All right. So I think there is a real sort of socio-political aspect to working in persona. Persona kind of allows us to, put on the guise and perhaps say something that like we perhaps are a little bit trepidatious to say otherwise. But I think there's always a socio-political aspect to putting on a face that is not our faces. That the ruse, the mask, is perhaps the closest we ever come to a sense of a true self, because the masquerade is who we are, right? As they say, like, we are born naked and the rest is drag, right? But I also think that, like, another reason that the persona poem can be so, like, sort of very powerful is that it very directly engages with the act of empathy. Writing is always an act of empathy. But in the persona poem, we actively try to sort of put ourselves in the shoes of somebody else, to see the world differently. And I think that's something that is so needed today. Like, the news, like, politics today talks ad nauseum about why is there such division in the nation right now. I think a lot of it is, comes from the sense that we're all sort of living in our bubbles. We all kind of create our own media, our own sort of like, sort of niches within the world. And we're not asked anymore to really, be, to kind of engage with empathy. Like, empathy remains one of the most important tools we have to rediscover what is common amongst all of us, what binds us together rather than what separates us. But it also allows us to sort of see how a unique positionness kind of allows us to see the world differently. So I think, like, persona can be a wonderful tool to help kind of get at who we are, in a way that is sort of powerful, right? So I'll end this sort of talk with an assignment that I often give to my students, right? So I'm going to ask you all to go out and write a persona poem. Choose a persona that you find fascinating. This might be a historical figure, a mythological figure, a figure from comic books, history, like politics, like, popular culture, someone that you find really unique. And then try to sort of channel that voice. And once you have that persona, and once you've kind of got it, kind of got that voice going, I want you to, in the process of writing, to have that persona reveal a secret to the audience, right? This is a speaker who wants to admit something they've never admitted to before. So there's an aspect of perhaps confession here that I think will be really exciting, right? So A few things to sort of note. I would stress that you can fictionalize these characters. Don't feel too wedded to the facts, especially if you're working with a well-known figure, historical figure. Don't feel like that you have to necessarily be sort of curtailed by what we historically know about this figure. History leaves a lot of gaps, and sometimes real creativeness can come from really digging into the areas where we perhaps don't know information about a particular person or persona. Also, like, another way of saying this is don't go for the obvious, right? It's going back to that metaphor of Superman, right? A poem that sort of shows Superman when he is at his strongest is perhaps okay, but perhaps a more interesting poem would be one that shows the persona of Superman when he's at his most vulnerable, when he is in those states of anxiety, fear, doubt, right? That's maybe like the more interesting poem that you could write about Superman, right? So the goal here is to see if you can sort of channel this persona and say something surprising. Again, don't forget, the persona is revealing a secret to the audience. So give that a try. And I think like what you'll discover is that as you go to put on this mask to become somebody else, what might emerge is just a secreted away part of yourself that through this sort of guise is allowed to speak in a way that it perhaps hasn't been allowed to speak before. All right, well, with that, I will close things out. And perhaps Charlotte can come back on and perhaps we can have a discussion of some of the things that we've talked about.
Thank you, Brad. That was fabulous. It seemed like in some ways you're talking about how the use of persona is another way to investigate the self, even though at first glance it might seem to be separate from the self. But I wrote something down. I wrote a few things down that you said, being the good student. We bury the self to allow it to reemerge. So it's almost a way to take away one's conscious awareness of one's positionalities and how identity is formed. And you can almost forget and just think, well, I'm creating a character.
Yeah.
But that character is very revealing as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's like, it's an echo of that sort of famous line by Gustave Flaubert, who is Madame Bovary, chez moi, right? It is me, right? Yeah. So there's this sense of that when we create a kind of alter ego, well, of course, what emerges is us. There's nothing really that else that could emerge, right? But I think it's a way of kind of tricking ourselves into maybe sort of pursuing aspects of ourselves that we repress. I mentioned those devil poems that I wrote for the collection Rare Earth. To tell you a little bit about myself, in my day-to-day life, I'm a very rational person, right? I am the person who makes lists. Everything in my desk has to be a certain way. I am very ordered, right? So, so nothing could be farther from me in some ways than this image of the devil, the embodiment of chaos, right? Of a world in complete disorder. But what I found when I started writing those poems was that I was totally seduced by the allure of that. And I was actually kind of surprised that it was alluring, right? Because I was writing about topics such as, well, the height of disorder, like death, the breakdown of society, all these things that were really kind of scary topics in some ways, right? But in taking on that voice of the devil, I was able to kind of write those poems almost as if I was seducing myself into kind of loving the chaos, loving that disorder of the world. And that was kind of surprising. I didn't kind of think that was an aspect of myself that was there. And yet it's what emerged when I started writing those poems.
So for someone who is maybe just beginning to think about using persona, do you have any cautions? Because I think that sometimes people are, sometimes autobiography almost is a fallback because someone's afraid of appropriation, let's say, and that is a concern, right? And that should be a concern. at the same time, do you have any suggestions for people who do want to move into writing outside of their personal experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I would say, like, that's a really great topic, and one that has really, really come to the forefront, this idea of appropriation, right? Like,
Mhm.
what is it appropriate? What do we have kind of like access to when we go to write from the space of the other?
Yeah.
I come from the to that kind of topic in a different kind of way. I think, like, that appropriation has been a kind of political tool of like the queer community, since its inception. I mean, I talked about sort of drag culture, the Leatherman of BDSM culture. In some ways, those were really sort of political gestures, right? Like, it was almost as if the queer community was saying, you know, uh, you know, you all think of me as a gay man as being a not quite valid man, like, I'm the feminized man, et cetera, et cetera. So drag became a way of maybe kind of enacting gender in a political sense, right? Like, I'm going to show you that I can be, just as, like, feminine and female as, like, as anyone else, and I'm going to do it, like, better than you could, right? This idea
Mm.
that it's a
Uh-huh.
political act. It's sort of, there's something in your face about it, like, but also something that's very kind of coy and playful as well.
Right.
Um, and yeah, so I think appropriation doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. In some ways, what's, like, we learn from drag is that, when you see, like, a drag performer, what becomes really clear very quickly is the love of that persona that they're taking on, that
Mm.
there's a sort of admiration there
Right.
that is in no way meant to be kind of diminutive. It's meant to be
Mhm.
celebratory, right? So I think in our writing, this question becomes like, well, how do we get to that space when we go to write as the other? Um, this is something that Stephen Schwartz kind of talked about in that essay I mentioned, Finding a Voice in America.
Mhm.
You know, he talked a lot about that the ultimate goal of a writer should be this sort of space of generosity, right? That when we open ourselves up to new experiences, you have to get it right. And part of that, came down to this sort of generosity of spirit, if you will. But that's kind of a vague term, right? I think a lot of students today, if I were to say that in my classroom, they'd be like, well, what does that really tell me about, like, how to properly and respectfully take on a persona that is not mine, right? Well, I think, like, you have to, put in the work, do the research, right? Really, like, sort of, you know, um, try to, like, sort of engage with that other in a way that creates more space for them, right? As I said, as I mentioned, I've been doing a lot of research into BDSM culture recently. And this is something that comes up quite a bit in, sort of discussions of BDSM, like, since play sessions might often engage in role plays
Yeah.
that might be, kind of in some ways sort of problematic or risky. How do you sort of negotiate that in a way that's where all parties are sort of safe, right? And, you know, in some of my research, what I have found is a lot of kind of participants in those communities, the rule of thumb that they sort of go with is that as long as power is flowing to the disenfranchised, so that like they are kind of made kind of more powerful, more like themselves, then it's a positive thing, right? Um, an example would be that if you were to imagine a play session where a lot of kind of the ultra rich were to kind of dress up as if they were, sort of working class citizens, and in a way to sort of create this sort of erotic fantasy, that might be a little unpalatable. You're like, I don't know about that.
Mhm.
And I think the reason it's a little icky is because power is flowing in the wrong direction, right?
Mm.
But if you think about that same phenomenon, right, through films such as like Paris is Burning, which sort of featured the ball scenes of New York City, where you found a lot of communities of color who would kind of adopt,
Mm.
the sort of the garb, the sort of the drag of the hyper rich in order to kind of play at sort of a world that they couldn't access. Well, that's sort of like, a scenario where the disenfranchised are empowered, right? So then it becomes a celebration in a sense, right? So I think that's the tricky part, right? Sort of figuring out how do we get to that space of generosity. But I think also we might be just in a historical moment where I think a lot of like the sort of anger and perhaps like, sort of resentment that you hear from a lot of writers of color when they sort of talk about white writers sort of adopting the guise of the, say, racialized other. One, it comes from like a sense that those communities often feel like that they do not have an equal playing field in terms of accessing, the writing world, publishing, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's a burden for all of us that we need to kind of, sort of fight to deconstruct that systemic racism that is very much a reality within the publishing world.
That's right.
But I think also maybe like it sort of suggests that when we hear those sort of complaints, I think that like there's this sense of like, why are you kind of taking on like, the guise of me in order to sort of advance your career, when maybe what's more needed, what's the sort of like more difficult assignment is for white writers to really try to sort of figure out what is the mask of whiteness? What does it mean to be white in these sort of systems of systemic racism? And how do I sort of like, play a part in that? I think that's really the more difficult assignment. And I think maybe this sort of moment of, kind of talking about cultural appropriation is maybe an acknowledgement that like white writers, white culture have not done enough in really trying to sort of figure out how do we sort of participate in these systems? Because whiteness in America is very much sort of, it hides in plain sight. Like, whiteness is often thought of as the norm, the center. So it's never sort of questioned. I think through persona, kind of acknowledging, like doing writing that kind of acknowledges those masks, maybe we can get kind of, maybe we can start to kind of take apart those systems of privilege and power.
I love that.
I hope
I think
anyway.
I think that's a great place to end this talk too, and be thinking about how persona can do some of this work that needs to be done.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Brad. That was just a fabulous talk.